much, Tiffany, and I'm delighted to be joining all of my co-panelists today and presenting the Economist's view of 2020 and to share our perspective on what are the key trends you need to watch in the coming years. So what I want to do, take a few minutes first, is to give a quick overview of some of the things that the Economist Intelligence Unit is watching for 2020 and beyond. We have had so many different events pop up since the beginning of the year. Of course, the most important one that has disrupted global supply chains and businesses, as well as our daily lives, has really been the corona crisis, but that hasn't been the end all of it. We've had many other events, especially around the geopolitical front, that have shaped some of the outlook for the future. So if I start with the corona crisis, here you see some major points that we've put down. It's definitely affecting, as you know, all of the developed and emerging economies. If you look at just the G20, the EIU is only expecting China to register positive growth in 2020 at about 1.5 to 2% growth rate for China this year. But besides China, no other major economy will perform well this year. And I guess the key thing for us we are looking at is where do we go from here in the second half of the year. The first half was clearly disastrous. Now, analysts, political scientists, business leaders are all hoping that the second half of the year will register a pickup and some light at the end of the tunnel. And we are expecting that is going to slowly happen, but not without a lot of bumps along the way and many risks ahead. We are worried, for example, of the new waves of coronavirus that are sweeping through economies that have lifted their restrictions on the economy. You're thinking about, for example, Australia, to some extent Vietnam, China, that have all had some importation of corona crisis cases. And this has led to reinstituting some of those restrictive measures, and that has put a dampening effect on businesses who were hoping that we could be done away with the corona crisis and move on with our lives. At the moment, a lot of businesses and households are being bankrolled by the government as well as fiscal monetary policy makers. So institutions such as the US Fed are directly taking on the debt of companies that are going through some troubles. And this has in some ways softened the impact. And that's what the second theme we're looking at this year, dangerous growth here that I've labeled, is really what this is about. That it's currently a lot of the policy measures, while absolutely necessary to enable businesses to keep afloat and people to have food on their table, is prolonging some of the adjustment periods that we know in the end will need to take place. The world in a post-COVID era, if you can envision that, say 2 or 3 years from now, if we can get there, will look very, very different from the one that we left in 2019. We're already feeling so much of that, businesses having to move online, consumer behavior changing, travel no longer seen as a necessity for businesses, for example, because we can do conferences like this on Zoom. And that is going to inflict pain on those sectors that have been very dependent on those practices before the corona crisis. So what we are worried about is that bankruptcies, unemployment could possibly go up when eventually the fiscal policy makers and monetary policy makers have to take away some of that support that they have been receiving from their businesses and governments. For what you can see in the stock market is that there has already been a disconnect between what you see in share prices versus what you see in the real world. And that is a direct consequence of the huge amounts of huge amounts of monetary injections that have been put in by central banks. And that's creating some measure of imbalances. If you're here in Singapore, for example, you might find it surprising that real estate prices have not gone down at all. Neither have COE prices. And one of the reasons is because this has been a very unequal crisis. White collar workers, such as myself or my colleagues and many of the people that I meet, have been able to hold on to their jobs fairly well by remote working and new patterns of organizing. But many blue-collar workers are not so lucky. And this has meant that they have suffered disproportionately, and now governments need to find a way to transit these, I guess, vulnerable workers into areas of growth in the economy, and that's going to take time, and it's going to be a painful process. The third theme that we're looking at is tied to this, of how the changing nature of the economy and society will mean that there will be winners and losers. As you've seen, the big tech companies, for example, have done very well for themselves, and also some of the bigger multinationals that have been able to get the right resources to fund themselves through the crisis. But the SMEs in particular are in many ways disadvantaged because they do not have the same sets of resources and lines of help as bigger businesses do. The too big to fail debate has been around for the last couple of months, and you see even the US government bailing out or not bailing out or supporting companies like Apple, while many of the other smaller companies do not get access to that kind of help, because the rationale from big governments is that but large companies hold large amounts of workers, and they need to protect these workers. The relationship, however, between the state, therefore, and big business is changing. And this ties in with another debate that we are hearing a lot about, which is around nationalism and protectionism. We are recommending all of our clients at the Economist Corporate Network to think carefully about their future relationship with their home governments. If they are receiving support, or if big business in general is receiving support from governments, you can expect that down the line, those governments are going to impose some sort of requirements from you, whether it is onshoring or making sure that you employ enough local workers. That is not an unreasonable request, because at the end of the day, they are using taxpayers to support these companies. So that relationship between the state and the economy and big business is changing. And then the last thing I might talk about is geopolitics, which I'm sure we'll come to many, many times during this event and this conversation. That one of the things this crisis has shown is that China has been a very effective leader throughout. It managed to stamp out the coronavirus within its own borders very effectively, especially when you compare the performance with other much bigger nations such as the US or UK. I think this is not necessarily linked to whether you're democratic or autocratic, but it's really about the competence of those governments. You can say, for example, you can argue that the likes of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson are not really interested in governments. They are interested in performance of the politicians. Whereas there are many other democratic governments, such as in New Zealand, in Germany, that are very interested in governance. So it's not really a debate about whether it's liberal or autocratic, but really about how good your leaders are and how interested they are in public services. By the end of the day, what this has shown is that China has been a very effective governor, and it is our expectation that China's relationship is going to be a lot more important for the rest of the world, and in particular in Asia. And of course, China policymakers understand this as well, and have been in some ways leveraging on this position of strength to make other countries see it their way. For example, with what's happened in Hong Kong, in the South China Sea, with tariffs in Australia, it is clear that they are using their position of strength at the moment to show some geopolitical muscle and weight. And the US is, of course, not taking this lightly. And therefore, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen this horrific trend of events where the US has lashed out on so many policies in order to inflict threats and pain on the Chinese government, from the bans today that you see, for example, on Huawei, and US companies no longer being able to sell to Huawei. And of course, you know about TikTok, but it's also on the finance industries, on the manufacturing industry, all of that's coming. So for many businesses, we are also recommending that they think very carefully about their geopolitical vulnerabilities, to know if push comes to shove, which line of the fence they should be standing on, and how that would impact their business. because as much as you hope it will not happen, there could be a risk where you're forced to choose between these two big powers. I'm sure Huawei and TikTok did not wish this fate for themselves, but it's happened. And there are many other businesses that have come under the firing line. HSBC, for example, in some ways, many of the other Chinese firms too have come under the radar of the US firm. US government. So this is the overview of some of the trends we're watching that have unfolded this year and will likely to persist into next year. Let me then delve into the first theme around how the impact of the corona crisis is impacting economies in the world. As I mentioned, only China out of the G20 will grow this year. But here you're looking at a landscape of many other countries that the year you forecast growth for. Just to explain a little bit of the chart, here every country is represented by a hexagon, and the hexagon is colored according to the legend on the right, which shows the growth rates of the country that we're expecting for this year. And the first thing that really pops out at you is that there's a fair amount of red, a good amount of red and orange, representing above 0% growth rates for 2020 in Asia. So that's the first good news to take away from this chart. Some pockets of Africa as well, but they're coming from low bases with fairly small sized markets. So for many businesses, it's more important to focus your attention and investment into this part of the world, Asia region. In some ways, you can say this was first in, first out. So China was the first to get hit, and it spread very quickly to countries like Singapore through the travel channels and the trade channels. As well as the rest of the neighboring countries of Asia outside of China. And now we're all slowly getting back on our feet. But even within the region, you can see there's a wide variation of growth rates we project for this year. So as I said, China will grow, but also Vietnam and Myanmar will. They're also much smaller economies. For different reasons, they will grow. Vietnam, for example, is similar to China in its ineffectiveness in clamping down the virus and getting manufacturing supply chains, especially those linked to China, up and running as fast as possible. For Myanmar, though, it's a different story. It's more that the government there has not paid too much attention or not have been able to invest too much resources into eradicating the virus. And in some ways, you can argue that they are sacrificing lives in order to ensure that the economy continues to rumble. And that is a picture that you see also in Indonesia. We're bringing out Indonesia growth rates down to about -2% just in the last few days because of the data that has been coming out. About one of the reasons that at first we thought Indonesia would do quite well, or at least relatively speaking, do okay, at about flat or just under flat growth, is that it's also sacrifice a lot of lives in order to ensure that livelihoods continue. The clampdowns have not been very strong there in Indonesia. Another thing to point out is Indonesia is not that plugged into global supply chains as other ASEAN economies are, such as Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, which you can see here in this chart are going to be doing the worst of the lot in terms of growth rates for 2020, at around -6% on average for those three countries. They are highly dependent on trade, tourism, travel, manufacturing, all of those industries that have been greatly disrupted in the first 6 months, and also those industries that will take the longest time to recover. And in that context, unemployment, bankruptcies becomes a particular issue for those three countries. I'd like to take a pause now to take a poll of the audience. We would like to. Sorry, I can't. Tiffany, do you think you could launch the poll? I can't seem to be doing that when I'm on screen share.
Sure, not a problem. I'll launch it from my side here.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask our audience was, as they look into the region of Southeast Asia, what are some of the countries they're looking into investing? As they look into the rest of China, rest of Asia as well, what are some of the countries they're interested in investing for the next 2 years? We'll return to those results later to just have an understanding from our audience how they're looking at the opportunity in the region. And as you answer that, I'm going to move on to the next few slides, and we'll return to the results just as I talk about Southeast Asia. So that was our picture for 2020. I recognize I went that through very quickly. So if there are any questions about any other particular country I didn't mention, please feel free to get in touch, either through the Q&A box or later on after the session. What I wanted to move on now is how we're looking at the years ahead. And here in this chart that you see here in the middle, I would like to welcome you to focus on these bars, these numbers here in these blue boxes, and that is where we expect that economy to recover to the 2019 levels. So for example, if you look at India, we're expecting the Indian economy to only recover to its level of 2019 size of the economy at the end of 2021. And that's a fairly good performance given that we're, I guess, quite bullish about India because of its very strong fundamentals despite its weak governance. What you can see, for example, in Japan, is that we're expecting a country like Japan only to recover to its 2019 levels in pretty much 5 years' time, right, the end of 2024. So, in the early parts of the crisis, you got a lot of people asking, is this a V-shaped recovery? Is this a U-shaped recovery? Is this a swoosh recovery, a Nike ticks recovery? And the answer really is now that it depends very much on the country itself. All of us, all economies went into this plunged face down very quickly together, but the road out, the climb out is going to be a lot more difficult for different countries at various degrees. And I put there the factors that we consider when we look at the journey towards recovery. It doesn't just depend now on how effective healthcare systems have been to eradicate the virus, but it depends on the ability of the government to provide more sustainable support measures. It depends on how the interest rates have performed and whether or not there's space to loosen monetary policy. It depends on whether or not they've used the time effectively in lockdown to reform some of their healthcare glitches, but also to think about new ways and directions for the economy. I think, as you can tell, I'm Singaporean, and I think one of the good things that the Singapore government has done is really a lot of that forward thinking during this time, right? If you look at past budgets, it's about investing into our future rather than just investing in the next 3 months. Unfortunately, many other countries do not have this luxury because they do not have the same sort of fiscal power. But then in the end, how long-term the government is willing to take and to invest into will be a measure of how quick and how sustainable the recovery will be. So I'm going to also move on to the next slide to talk about China. And China is not my main area of expertise, but China is also, I wanted to bring China up because China is the largest economy that has now emerged from the crisis, and we can draw useful lessons or hints of how the rest of the world might recover if we look at China's experience. And by and large, I think you'll hear from my other co-panelists later that by and large, China is reaching back normalcy. Many things have recovered, especially when you're looking at things like PMI figures. I've put up some more indicators here in back to normal indicators that you see, coal consumption, property sales, road traffic. All of that seem to signify that its levels today are very much similar to its levels at the beginning of the year, signaling that economic activity is back to normal. But if you look closely at other indicators, you'll find that not everything is so rosy. For example, here at the bottom chart, you see restaurant spending, flights. Those things have not recovered, and in our view, it's very unlikely that they will reach back to the 100% recovery phase. At The Economist, we have coined a term called the 90% economy, signaling that we believe roughly there's going to be a 10% unemployment rate throughout the world. China is no exception. That is something that we are expecting China's unemployment rate to settle at for the next few months, because many of the workers involved in retail, in services especially, are going to be heavily affected. Spending is not quite where it used to be. If you look, for example, on the chart on the right, you can see this is the GDP growth rate for China in the last few quarters. So the steep drop here in Q1, recovery in Q2, and a lot of that driven by the secondary and the primary industries, not so much the tertiary industries, meaning the services industries. And that is actually the picture that you see in many, many other economies. China already has the benefit of having a very large economy that they can use domestic stimulus and keep that activity within its borders. And it's not so easy for a small country like Malaysia or Thailand to do that. And at the end of the day, though, you see the same pattern where it's services that is really bleeding compared to manufacturing and supply chains, which admirably have really gotten back to less levels of disruption than we've seen during the peak of the crisis. I'm now going to talk about some of the Southeast Asia countries. And with that, I want to launch our results, share the results that you guys have in the poll that you've participated in. So you can see that China is still definitely a main area for your investment attention in the next 2 years, and that is definitely understandable. As I said, the EU also expects China to be the strongest among the major economies to recover. I can see that Indonesia is another big area where you're thinking of putting your time and resources into for the next 2 years, and you're neck to neck with Vietnam, as well as Singapore, roughly speaking, on the same page as well. And then beyond that, a smaller tier of countries are Malaysia, as well as Thailand, and a small number of you do not plan to invest. I think these are very interesting results, and I must say I'm not surprised by them. When I do these sorts of polls with many other business leaders, I get very much the same result. China definitely some place they still intend to invest in, despite the US-China trade war, despite the difficulties with the investment environment. It is still the largest growing market. There's still a lot of exciting opportunity. And it's now a China for China strategy that is really shaping up to be one of the key winning priorities for our businesses. And then I'm not surprised too about Indonesia and Vietnam, and hence, as you can see, I'm going to stop sharing the results now and move on to the next slide. That is exactly where I wanted to begin the Southeast Asia story, because I get a lot of these comments that Indonesia is where they're interested in. And I must say, though, that in the last few months, Indonesia has not done well on many, many fronts in terms of its governance, for example, and management of the health pandemic. Jokowi has not done a good job. One of the main hotspots in the region is in Indonesia, and it's very unclear how the pandemic is spreading, because data is not transparent and clear. And you see, as you look in this chart here, the GDP macroeconomic numbers are not looking good as well. There are many risks ahead for Indonesia, especially on the political front now that we're heavily watching. Jokowi was touted as the man that could reform many of the difficult investment environment issues for businesses, especially foreign businesses, around the labor law, the land laws, regulation. And he was supposed to be doing this in his second term. So when he won with a very good mandate in the second term, there was a lot of optimism from the business community. Right now, he's losing some of that confidence because of the way he's handled the crisis. And we're seeing that some of the policies he's pushing through is no longer sort of the big bang needed reforms, but really watered down policies that signal the weakening of his position in the cabinet. If you look at this chart here, here are the EIU's business environment rankings. At the EIU, we rank about 200 countries based on a whole different set of indicators that all we believe are important for evaluating how friendly a country is to business investment and foreign investment. And here I've just put up the scores for Indonesia. There are lots of numbers here. I'm just going to simplify it and ask you to focus on the regional rank and the regional countries here you see on the bottom. And to look at Indonesia's performance vis-a-vis the region. And what I'd like you to focus on is the labor market here at the bottom. So in the last 5 years, Indonesia's rank in terms of its labor market, ease of doing business for businesses, for companies who are in manufacturing, for example, where labor is a very important input. Indonesia has not been a friendly environment, especially because of this, and it's number 15 out of the rest of, and it ranks below a place like, say, Sri Lanka and even Pakistan. When you look at how they're going to do in the next 5 years, in fact, they go right to the bottom of the table. And that is a very, it's a sign that there is very difficult for Indonesia to become the China +1 base for manufacturing, because so many things are stacked up against manufacturers who want to move into Indonesia, and the labor market is just one example of that. I think, as I mentioned, Jokowi understands this. He's been trying to push through what they call the Omnibus law, but the success rates have been not very strong. And so I think while the optimism around Indonesia is shared with the audience, and I hear it a lot with the business community, the reality is that Indonesia remains a very difficult place to do business. And if you want to invest more in that, you have to have a very strong local partner, a very deep understanding of politics, and be able to have the right relationships. It's very much a relationship-based economy. And for many multinationals, I've heard many, I guess, failure stories where they've gone in with a lot of optimism, but left with a lot of losses. Having said that, and I don't want to put such a dampener on the optimism here, but having said that, of course, Indonesia is interesting and attractive for many reasons, which you are, and I'm guessing that's why you are interested. The large demographic, young profile, tech savvy, a huge consumer base, the ability to tap into the domestic market. All of that remains true. But just I guess a word of caution that it's not so simple to do business in Indonesia. As I expected, you mentioned Vietnam. I think Singapore came above Vietnam and Indonesia for its attractiveness for the group audience here. But I think you know Singapore very well, so I'm going to skip Singapore and talk about Vietnam. Vietnam has one of the best performing economies in 2020. However, there are certain signs that we see the economy starting to slow down. So for example, unemployment rates have started to climb. Really not as bad as what you would see elsewhere in the economy. So I put some rates here, you know, urban employment at 4.5, rural at 1.8%. This is compared to, say, in the first quarter where those rates were roughly between 3% and 1% flat. So definitely an uptick in unemployment in both urban and rural areas, but not worrying signs. I think what will be more difficult for businesses is that wage growth now has been stemmed. So it's not so easy to get Vietnamese local people to spend. Private consumption is going down. But on the flip side, it does mean that costs are being held back for some businesses if they're relying on wage workers. And that has been a pressure point for Vietnam in the last 2 or 3 years, where infrastructure has been extremely tight, as well as the job labor market has been extremely tight. So as a result, inflation and cost of doing business in Vietnam has been climbing, which has become a pressure point. So the good news is that the downturn will help to limit that amount of inflation. But at the same time, it does mean that the market opportunity for consumer firms won't be as bright as before the corona crisis. However, just to summarize, you know, Vietnam remains a very strong shining star on our radar as well. We see a lot of good activity, and more importantly, I think the government is keen on enacting reforms to help push through free trade agreements, for example, and also cleaning up debt, restructuring SOEs. All of that we see to some reasonable level of confidence that it's improving. But at the same time, that they could be moving faster. Just moving on to Thailand, and then after Thailand, I'll talk about Malaysia and then move into another theme. So on Thailand, over the past weekend, I think you must have read in the news, the largest political rally since 2014. Just for interest, the picture that you see there with the 3 fingers, that's taken from the Game of Thrones. It's a way of showing the Thai citizens' displeasure with repressed governments. And it's come at the back of a really heavy economic downturn as well. You know, a lot of these tensions in Thailand have been bubbling under the surface for many years, years and years too long to count. But this has now been resurfaced right to the top because of the economic deprivation. In many respects, Thailand has suffered the worst because of its large dependence on exports and tourism. and as well because of its long shutdown from roughly the beginning of March, and now still a lot of restrictions being put in place. We are most worried about Thailand on this political front in terms of its long-term outlook as well. The politics is not favorable for investors who want to make huge investments, especially infrastructure investments, into Thailand. When I joined The Economist in 2011, I remember a lot of the presentations I used to do at that time was about Teflon Thailand and how no matter what happened on the political side, business moved on, the economy was rumbling okay because it was seen to be perceived as though politics and the economy are very much disjointed in Thailand, and that economic policy making, solid economic policy making, as well as a good business environment can still continue despite political crisis. I think that's changed dramatically now. Since 2015, Thailand has been absorbing less and less of FDI, and part of the reason is because businesses have gotten around to now believing that these tensions in Thai politics are never going to mend, and that it's going to create more uncertainty for their business. At the same time, Thailand has a very old demographic, difficult to find the right workers, and the society is also very unequal. So it's you see a lot of opportunity captured in large Thai local businesses. In Malaysia, Malaysia suffered its worst quarter in the second quarter of -17%, much worse than the year you expected. So we've been taking down our forecast for the year. In all the respects, as you see in this chart, private consumption, exports, investment, even government consumption has been falling. And that has contributed to a lot of concern with investors that they no longer bet on Malaysia climbing out of the middle income trap. I think the political situation has not helped. In some ways, Malaysia could be at the risk of following Thailand's route, where now business leaders are looking at Malaysia and thinking that some of the political tensions can never be resolved, and so you have a revolving door government, or you have, you know, some sort of like coups versus change in governments very in unexpected ways. And at the same time, the current government is not stable. So they're putting off a lot of their investments into Malaysia compared to in previous times. I think though Malaysia still has a lot of opportunity, especially ensuring that they can be a rival, for example, to Vietnam in certain respects, and a rival to Singapore in certain respects. It's had a very good, solid 20 years of growth, building up infrastructure and hubs for manufacturing, as well as some sorts of services, including financial services. But that is sort of slowing down. The hope that is if they can clean up their act on the politics side, they can refocus on good policies that can drive new investment into the economy. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and move on to the last theme I'd like to talk about, which is supply chains in Southeast Asia. You hear so much about, you know, this opportunity for our part of the world to take advantage of the US-China trade war to attract investments that are looking for alternatives to China. Let's just take a step back and look at the relationship that China has with the rest of the world. Here in this chart, you see that over 20 years, the share of trade that countries are doing with China has really, really increased at the expense of the US. So if you look, for example, at a country like the Philippines, in 2000, share of trade with the US was at about 25%. Share of trade with China was at about 5%. Fast forward to 2018, and that relationship completely turned on its head. And that is not Asia phenomenon. It happened all over the world. And that is really linked to China opening up and becoming very aggressive in attracting FDI. Then Donald Trump came into power, into the White House, and he identified this clearly as one of the main things that he wanted to take on and change that dynamic that China has with the world, starting with his own country. So here what we did was we looked at the change in the share of US imports between the second half of 2017 and the second half of 2019. And if I could just ask you to focus in on the red bars first, what you see then very clearly is that the US has had an aggressive, sort of, whether concerted or not, push towards sourcing from within their region. So the US buying from Mexico, buying from China, now at the expense of the China relationship. So China no longer exporting, or the share of China's exports are no longer the same as it was before. Southeast Asia is pretty much sitting on the fence for many industries, so we've neither kind of lost or gained a foothold into the US market in this 2-year period, but there are some industries that we have done better. So electronics, furniture, toys, textiles, clothing, where we've managed to edge out actually China. You can see the blue bars moving back and the yellow bars moving forward, meaning that more things have now been made and manufactured here in Southeast Asia and shipped directly to the US. The big question now then goes, well, where do we go from here, right? Textiles and clothing, furniture and toys, actually pretty low value added materials or goods. We don't want to be stuck in that lower levels of the supply chain. What we want to do is upgrade into higher value added things, especially in the electronic supply chain. So this is where a lot of I guess governments are hoping to build electronics expertise, so that they could also tie into the great wave of electronic exports heading to the US. But here then the picture doesn't get so optimistic. Here I put down the 5 top economies of Apple's supply chain. And here for manufacturing and suppliers, manufacturing locations and suppliers, you can see that China is a big play for Apple, as is many other developed nations of Asia. And you see no Southeast Asia country in this list. And that's pretty much the example for most high-tech electronic supply chains. I have many of them in my Economist Corporate Network, you know, from the likes of, say, Corning to HPE. A lot of them don't manufacture directly here in Southeast Asia in a big way. And they do that from the developed nations of Asia, Japan, Taiwan, Korea. And that is where they see bigger pools of talent and expertise to locate from. So I think Southeast Asia still has a long way to go. And therefore, kind of ending off this slide, this theme, just want to point out that despite all the concerns about the US-China trade war, China's lead in the manufacturing sector is just very, very difficult to upseat at this point in time. The chart that you see here, you can see China's share of global manufacturing added dwarfs any of the other 3. In fact, it probably is the same percentage as the other 3 major economies, industrial nations put together in terms of their contribution to the world's share of manufacturing output. And people are flocking to China also for the same reasons they have always been, which is it's a huge market. I've talked to many of our business leaders who are investing like you more into China because they believe that there is where they need to be putting the entire supply chain now to service the China market because they want to be close to that market. And so while they might be looking for alternatives, if possible, to move certain types of their supply chain out, the reality is that this lead is very difficult to unseat. So I'd like to end off my sort of overview of the world by showing you some of our recent covers. I'm just going back to about 4 months ago to give you a flavor of some of the things that the Economist newspaper have been looking at and we have identified as very important trends for years to come. In April 18th, we published a set of articles talking about the relationship between China and the world and the fact that the COVID situation has turned many against China, but at the same time, it's put China in a position of strength because it's able to educate the world on some of these practices, and you can see many other countries who have loathed to follow suit in China's footsteps have done so in terms of how they govern and manage the situation. We've talked about globalization, which I touched on today in our session, but in those articles that we released there, we talked about the dangers of governments trying to build their own supply chains within countries, such as around the food supply chain or around the electronic supply chain, because we argued that this is not going to be a risk-free in terms of what you want to do as a country and as a business is to diversify the supply chain, not to bring all of that home into one country. In July, we talked about the New World Disorder, which is really about how the international organizations that used to help support some of the trade relationships and geopolitical relationships, and I'm thinking about the WHO, the WTO, NATO. Many of these institutions now have been severely weakened, partly because of the US action. And this has allowed China to rise and pull its muscle in the geopolitical front. Just on my last slide, very recent articles, very recent covers, we talked about the Huawei issues and how in a landscape without trust, not just between the US and China, but between many other industrial nations as well as emerging markets, how businesses should be charting through their own strategies for manipulating, for managing these relationships. At the later part of July, we talked about how governments are now spending their way through this recession. Now they can do that because inflation is low, but the moment inflation starts to climb, they'll run into serious issues. And then just last week's Economist, we talked about Xi's new economy, which is how we argue Xi Jinping is shaping a new form of state capitalism, where he's gaining control of many private businesses, but at the same time allowing some room for entrepreneurship. And that has proven successful for this time to come. And it's going to seriously threaten Western views of capitalism. But at the same time, it's invoking a lot more adverse reactions from the rest of the industrial world. So I'll stop there and hand back to Tiffany.
Okay, and thank you, Pamela. Thank you for the wonderful sharing. Next up, we will be having our last speaker for today, Mr. Frank Puan, CEO, Executive Director from Sunset Group Private Limited. He'll be sharing more about the challenges he faced in his businesses with the new norm in place. How does he manage these issues, and what he foresees the future of the new norm of doing business will be like. So over to you, Frank.
Hey, thank you, Tiffany. It's good to be outside of Singapore for the first time in 5 months. So I'm currently in Malaysia, thanks to the RGL, reciprocal green lane between Singapore and Malaysia government. So I'm in the hotel now. Hopefully everyone can hear me good. I'd like to introduce a little bit about the company that I represent. I'm representing Sunseap. We are what we call a distributed utility player. Many people think that this is a mouthful. We are, after all, a solar energy company. So why distributed utility? I think we have gone beyond looking at solar generation, moving into energy retail, and also further that beyond into energy consumption and demand response, energy storage. I think earlier James was talking about EV, right? EV charging business as well. So, I spent some time talking about how COVID actually affect us as a company. So many people regard us as, I would say, a multinational company, but I think at the very heart, we are still very SME, right? So we are more small and medium enterprise in our culture. So today we are in 13 markets in Asia. So obviously because of the COVID situation, I can't travel. And I mentioned that this is the first time in 5 months I'm traveling. So a business has been difficult, I would say, all right? In the perspective that we cannot meet our partners face to face. I can't go on as usual to meet our overseas partners and colleagues, all right? And brainstorm about how our ideas about expansion as usual. Right, even coming into Malaysia today took me, I think, almost 2 hours at the immigration doing swab tests. So, so I think the COVID situation has affected all of us. But for us, I think it is also a good chance to do a refocus. So in terms of this 13 markets that we are in now, we have refocused. And I think it's no coincidence that we are refocusing in some of these markets where I think there is a better, I would say, recovery, all right? I think a lot of the two speakers earlier talk about recovery in different markets. And for us, we have chosen 4 markets to refocus. And these 4 markets, obviously, are Singapore, all right, Vietnam, China, and also Taiwan, all right? So I think these 4 markets speaks for itself. For Taiwan, it's almost as if the COVID hardly hit them, right? In fact, my Taiwanese colleagues hardly speak about the COVID. Obviously, they have the culture of wearing masks, and I think in terms of our construction work and installation work in Taiwan, it didn't really affect most of them. China has been a very fast in terms of the recovery process. So our projects in China is moving also at as per usual. I think the same is the same for Vietnam as well. I think the one that is affected most is really Singapore in terms of our installation pace. Obviously, that is also due to the foreign worker stuck in the dormitory situation, right? For that, I think our installation almost halted to almost zero over the last 5 months, right, in Singapore. But I think this COVID situation or this pandemic has also forced, I would say, a reset button, right? A reset in the sense that we need to refocus into what are the markets that is really important for us. So from us, I would say, give this example, the COVID is often seen as, I would say, described as a drowning man, right? So in this drowning man scenario, there is all sorts of grants and incentives. Yesterday, we just have our latest budget dished out by our finance minister, all right, to help this drowning man. But beyond this, I think a distance away, there's a bigger tsunami. And this tsunami is actually climate change, right? And I think the way that we are looking at COVID or this pandemic situation where you have the entire world solving a problem on a united front, I think we managed to do a lot of improvements, right, in terms of understanding about the virus, understanding about this pandemic situation, understanding about the economic and social problems that it brings as well. So for us, I think if we can use the same passion, right, and the same united front to tackle this climate change problem, this sustainability problem, I think the world will be recovering much faster. So some also say the renewable economy or the sustainable economy is the recovery economy now. All right. So how has it affected us as an SME in Singapore? I think this whole work from home situation, because we have been working from home, or the majority of us in the company, about 70% has been working from home. We have only about less than 30% at any point in the office. This hasn't helped in the productivity. I think there was also a news article out yesterday that talks about this. I think we can't sit in the same office, look each other in the eye and brainstorm ideas on how we can, take the business forward. So this lack of interaction, I would say, has actually forced us to slow down certain pace in the markets. So I mentioned there is a refocus of 4 markets in Asia, right? But at the same time, it also allows new opportunity, right? So we have a Japan office, and in this Japan office, I can share also that we managed to, through a virtual interaction, right, through Zoom and Teams meeting, actually close a deal, right, in Japan. So we actually did a successful M&A deal in Japan, and upon that, right, I mean, these are colleagues. We have some of them we have never seen, right? So we are now colleagues with the Japan office, because after the M&A deal, now through them, right, we begin to impart some knowledge and transfer about what we do in Singapore to the Japanese market, and begin to look for Japanese clients, all right, throughout this whole COVID situation. I think this is a good example of, I would say, I think making use of this pandemic situation as a reset button and rethink markets and reinvent how we do our business on the day-to-day basis, right? So basically, I have not done an M&A deal in my whole life where we actually sign shareholders agreement before actually meeting the partner. So this is a really a new world order, all right? But back at home, I would say, I think something more troubling, which is obviously the economic and the social problems that is brought along together with this COVID situation. So for example, I mentioned about, I think everybody is familiar with the foreign worker stuck in a dormitory situation. All right, so other than being a health issue, so now many of our contractors were not able to get onto the installation jobs that we had, all right, because they have simply no workers. During the circuit breaker, 2 months of circuit breaker, because our industry is labeled as the essential service industry, so we were still allowed to get on to install projects. Especially there is one project which is the floating PV project in between Singapore and Malaysia. So we were allowed the opportunity to actually install, but we had 0 workers. So what we began to do is we actually got volunteers from the office. So this, bear in mind, these are not your blue collar workers, but your our finance people, our engineers, all right, our systems design persons, of draftsmen, right? So all these people volunteer, including ladies, mind you. So they actually went on site and do the installation. So I volunteer for a couple of days during the circuit breaker as well. So what does this tells me? This tells me that we can actually build the systems, right? In this case, the solar energy systems with our own hands. And could it be possible that this pandemic situation allows then a reset button in terms of the way we treat, or rather look at this whole foreign dependency on foreign worker situation? Is it possible then now we use locals, right, to do this installation work? So I think just now we talk about this drowning man as well as the I think a tsunami, which is the climate change sustainability related issues. Could it be then we actually solve both problems together by accelerating some of these climate change targets, right? You know, we have a lot of targets in Singapore that's all pegged to 2030. Somehow, I think that is also the year that we peg our carbon targets. So hence, a lot of sustainability targets are all pegged to 2030. For example, our PV installation capacity is pegged to 2030. We need to install 2 gigawatts. All right, 2 gigawatts, 2,000 megawatts. Today, we are at near to 350 megawatts. Then our green mark in terms of buildings in Singapore, 80% has to be green mark by 2030. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the 30-30, right, which is the amount of food that we grow, or vegetables that we grow in Singapore. We want to be self-sustainant by 30% by 2030 as well. So now all these targets, if we were to accelerate them, and instead of the next 10 years, and bring forward that target in the next 3-4 years, how many jobs can this create? Could it be that if we accelerate these targets, all these new jobs can then be taken by locals, and thereby also resolving some part of the unemployment problem? I think these are things to really think about. So yesterday we also had the budget that talks about a certain wage subsidies for employers that actually look into hiring locals. So to us, I think we are beginning this whole concept about, you know, instead of hiring a faceless foreign worker to do the job for us, and depending on subcons who then in turn depend on other subcons, I think we are now reinventing to say, can we hire locals? Now, this also brings along a whole new set of issues as well, because previously we used to do things the same way for the past maybe 2-3 decades in terms of installation of a solar system. All right, we have our rack and rails, right, which is very heavy, right? You need to hoist all those rack and rails up. We do a lot on our projects on HDB rooftops, on a residential area. Now those heavy equipment that we hoist up, can it be reinvented? We need to redesign them. Can it be a lightweight, but yet stronger materials, right? Because now the person that is doing the installation work is not a faceless foreign worker anymore, but perhaps it is our own friends or even ourselves, right? Going up the roof to do this installation. So I think all this is new things to think about, but for us, it's an opportunity to reset. For us, it's also an opportunity to address the bigger tsunami, which is the sustainability related issues. So I think we are now, Sunseap, together with the industries at various industries in Sustainable Energy Association of Singapore, SEAS, I think we are trying to put up a paper to encourage the Singapore government to actually accelerate these goals. Instead of waiting for the next 10 years, we are talking about accelerating them in the next 3-4 years. And thereby, our current calculations looks into creating more than 30 to 40,000 jobs, right, for locals who will then be trained during this period. I think it's not a new strategy during an economic crisis. Usually governments will look into infrastructure development, right? So in this case, it's a sustainable infrastructure development, right? We talk about EV charging points. Can we, instead of waiting for the next 10 years to roll out EV charging around Singapore, why not accelerate right? Even a mere 10% of our cars, the EV chargers to EV ratio, I think we are talking about 100,000 chargers in Singapore, right? In the next 3 years. All right, so all this will create job opportunities and especially for the locals. So in return for this acceleration, maybe the government can also ask for whoever who is the awardee or the successful tenderer or the employer who is looking into the job or the project can hire X percentage of locals. I think this idea, really, I want to put it out there to the various Tauke's who is on the call itself to see whether you can join us together to solve this unemployment issue as well. So I'll end just there. Happy to take on any questions on sustainability related issues. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, and thank you, Frank. Thank you so much for your valuable insights. Now, before we start off with the Q&A session, for those who would like to receive the presentation deck, please take some time to scan the QR code on the screen right now to fill up a short form. After you have completed the form, the presentation deck will be sent to you in a few days' time later after editing is done. Now, without further ado, let us welcome back all our speakers. And together, we have with us for today, Professor Annie Koh, Professor of Finance, VP of Business Development from Singapore Management University, who will be joining us today as the moderator for the Q&A session as well. Now, if you have any questions for the speakers, feel free to submit them by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in your questions. Do note that as we have limited time to the Q&A session, we will not be able to answer all questions. So now, let me pass over to you. Prof. Koh, please.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you very much to the whole team. I think this is amazing. We are having a new normal. Now, I don't know how many of you actually read titles, but I really like this session title. It's about rethinking and reshaping your company to the next future. And this is about the new era of globalization. So I want to take the big ones first, and then I'm going to zoom in a little bit on Frank and how he deals with all this backdrop of challenges, and then come back to sector questions, because many of you are asking which sector should we put our bet on. But the first question, and I think this is critical, it's no longer just about economics. It's economics and politics in the last few years. But COVID-19 has accelerated this challenge between blocks of countries. So one great question is, how do you think businesses should navigate this increased trends of regionalization due to a lot of controls from COVID, actual border controls, but also increasing nationalism? Any one of you can jump in. All right. Anyone? Pam?
Thanks very much, Annie. Yeah, I'm happy to start off and pitch in. So I think you just really need to embrace it. It's a force that is inevitable. It's going to happen. I hear a lot of, I guess, concerns within the business community that in particular, the digital space is splintering. So if you are operating, for example, in China, there's increasing requirements for you to be hosting data on local cloud. And if you're a US multinational or a British multinational, that obviously creates new operational challenges for you. But if you don't do that, then the reality is that you won't be able to operate in China. And that is being the biggest growth market in the world for many, many more years to come, you need to start thinking about how you do that. I think in terms of nationalism, it's something that it will happen at various degrees throughout the world. And thankfully, we're actually seeing that in Asia, it's not having the same amount of, I guess, aggression as it is in other parts of the world. If you look at Southeast Asia in particular, of course, you will hear some strands of nationalistic policies running through, especially in, I guess, more democratically elected governments, such as Indonesia or in India. But if you compare that to what's going on in Europe and the US, it's still at a reasonable, tolerable level for businesses. So while they need to take care about that, it's still the best strategy is to be based in Asia. Our advice for companies is they need to think very carefully, or I guess proactively, about the pipeline of local talent. And even in a country like Singapore, hiring foreign labor is going to get harder and harder, not just because Singapore has been a very open economy and it will remain an open economy, especially relative to other countries. But the reality is that the job situation for many locals is getting more challenging, and you can't expect local governments to ignore that. So they will need to see businesses putting in commitments into hiring and developing local talent. And as long as you show that commitment early on and follow through with that, I think those governments will want to embrace your investment into their region, right? It's not going to be, at least in many places in Asia, it's not going to be a case of you cannot hire any more foreign workers, period. It's going to be, you have to balance the amount of foreign workers and foreign investment that you have in the business versus the pipeline of building and developing local talent and local investments and partnerships. So start thinking about that early, how you build that diversity within your organization.
Very nice. So I'm not going to ask the rest to repeat on that, but glocalization. Go global by thinking and helping local as well. Nicely, quickly segue to Frank. So Frank, how adaptable are you? So given this whole backdrop, given all these contrasting views and all the different things that are happening, how are you adapting the business, and what's your forward outlook in the next 2 quarters? I have people always asking only 2 quarters.
Yeah, happy to share that. But maybe before that, I'll talk a little bit about the China-US situation. I think at least from the perspective of, I would say, from the solar industry, it's not the first time that we have this situation on manufacturing outside of China solar panels, right? Could we have it in the US? Could we have it in Asia? There are newer developing countries with lower cost of labor than China. Could we then manufacture it there? I think this is also why I say this is not the first time, because before COVID, right, we already have the trade wars where the US is imposing very high import tariffs because they accuse the Chinese of anti-dumping, right, or dumping. So they have anti-dumping tariffs. The EU has also anti-dumping tariffs on the made in China panels as well. I think from that perspective, the companies have tried. They have tried to manufacture outside of China. All right, but the reality is that the entire value chain in terms of raw materials are all in China. The silicon, the glass, the various raw materials they have in China, now they ship out those raw materials from China to the location and assemble it in location. Right, this happens in many parts of Malaysia and Vietnam, right? So they call them now made in Malaysia, made in Vietnam, but those materials are actually from China. All right, so there is already a situation like that, but I think the companies still find it difficult because in the end, it still depends on the entire value chain, all right, supply value chain. So for us as a company, I think I mentioned earlier that we have to refocus and adapt. There were a lot of plans that we had for example, to Indonesia this year, all right? We had to scrap them because simply we couldn't travel, all right? So if to me, I mentioned, we have a very SME attitude, right? So the very practical way of thinking about this is, do we have a local champion there? If we have a local champion on the ground, right, then we will begin to look into the expansion into that market. No matter how good a market is, and then from an economic point of view or recovery point of view, if you have no guys on the ground, there's no way you can travel there now. There's no way to can expand into the market. So if you have a local presence there already or a local reliable partner, can we then tap on that? All right. I had discussions on, with friends who are in the F&B sector as well. Some of them, they have presence already in China. Some don't. Can those that without the presence in China tap on friends who they are friends in Singapore from one F&B brand to another F&B brand? Can they then tap on the presence of a friend's presence in China, a friend's company in China? Can they do that? I think they can. So this is a new way of collaboration. Instead of doing everything yourself, you need your physical presence there. All right. So I think that is in a way how we adapt. So I shared about refocusing into a various market, but at the same time, because we have forged some partnerships prior to the COVID situation in Middle East, in Japan, right? So we were able to execute some of these deals even during the circuit breaker, even working from home and we never see our partners before. Or rather, if you never see your partners before, it's hard. But if you've seen the partners before and then you have established something, a trust between the partners, then not seeing them during this period and moving ahead, I think it's fine because you have already established that. Yeah.
Very good. Frank, I know you have to run to another speaking engagement, so just a very quick one line. What advice do you have for many small, medium enterprises who are like you? I know you're in Series E of your funding now. What future plans and what advice would you give to fellow SMEs?
I think for us, we have always been persistent with if we believe it's a good idea, I think we want to be persistent in it, right? And the persistent payoff. I think despite having a lot of regulatory challenges, because energy has a lot of regulatory challenges everywhere you go, all right? So we persist, and I think it comes a right point of time that your idea, if you believe in it, I think it will work out. So for us, I think the plan, again, speaking for myself as well, we have plans to go listing this year. But obviously now because of the pandemic, we have hold it back. But I think we want to retry, of course, markets willing next year, right? So yeah.
And I'm assuming you're going to list in Singapore Exchange, right? Your home group.
We are a Singapore company, so yes. Singapore Exchange, yeah.
Thank you. All the best, Frank. We'll let you off. Ladies and gentlemen, I know we've exceeded the time, so I'm going to pass it back to Tiffany. But we've had a great panel, and they've definitely helped us to rethink and reset our strategy going forward in the era of new globalization. Tiffany, all yours.
Thank you very much, Prof. Cole. Okay. Now, the discussion was definitely most fruitful, and we hope that the participants have benefited a lot from this webinar. And before we end off this session, we'd also like to inform you that SCCCI is offering a special discount for new members to sign up before 21st September 2020. The promotion details are on the screen, so do call in or email us if you are interested to join our membership. Now, last but not least, we have other exciting tracks and top-notch speakers lined up for you too. Please continue to join us on the upcoming tracks or scan the QR code to view for the full programs itself. Finally, please let us also have your feedback on SME ICC Live through the feedback survey. You may scan on the QR code on the screen right now or follow the redirect link after you have closed this session. If you have submitted this survey before, you do not need to submit the survey anymore. So we hope to see you in future SCCCI events. And once again, thank you so much for all the speakers and the participants. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.